Usually when we talk about building a massive structure, we picture like steel beams, pouring concrete, studying blueprints.
Right, the physical stuff.
Exactly. And we all know that if the foundation is cracked, the whole skyscraper is coming down. But when we talk about building human knowledge, like the actual verifiable truth that governs medicine or psychology, the materials we're building with are completely invisible. We're building with information.
And that invisible architecture is arguably way more fragile. I mean, think about the 1999 Mars Climate Orbiter.
Oh, the NASA mission, right?
Yeah. NASA spent like $125 million building this incredible machine. They launched it into space and then just watched it burn up in the Martian atmosphere.
Just completely disintegrated.
Totally. And why? Because one engineering team used metric units and another used imperial units.
You're kidding.
Oh, the raw numbers were never properly verified. The actual physical hardware was flawless, but because the foundational information was flawed, the entire structure of reality for that mission just collapsed.
Wow. And that is exactly what we are digging into today. Because for you listening, understanding how to engineer that invisible knowledge is the absolute key to your success.
It really is.
Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is highly specific. We are creating the ultimate audio cheat sheet to make you fully exam ready.
Ready to crush it.
Yes. We are unpacking the core concepts of research methodology based exclusively on Chapter 2. Steps of research from what I honestly consider the essential survival guide for this. UGC NET Paper 1 Unlocked, Volume 2, Research Aptitude by Aswathi VP. If you are serious about passing the UGC NET exam, which, demands some really deep critical thinking, this book is your absolute blueprint.
It's the definitive resource, no question. And as we go through this, I want you to remember that the examiners aren't just testing if you can, like memorize a dictionary.
Right.
They're testing if you fundamentally understand how knowledge is gathered, verified, and trusted. When you get the why behind a method, the what just becomes second nature.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the raw materials. Let's invent a hypothetical scenario to track how this works.
Okay, I like it.
Imagine you're a researcher, and there's a sudden, unexplained spike in severe insomnia across a major metropolitan city.
Okay.
Before you can analyze why people aren't sleeping, you have to actually gather the info. The text formally calls this foundation data collection and verifying data. And obviously, you can't just stand on a street corner and yell, "Hey, are you tired?"
Right. No. Data collection and verifying data is a highly systematic process. You're gathering information on specific variables. And the crucial mechanism here is transparency.
Transparency meaning?
Meaning, if another researcher cannot follow your exact steps to get the same data, your findings are worthless.
Wow.
Yeah. Maintaining clean, reliable data requires rigorous verification. You have to constantly cross-reference your inputs.
So in our insomnia study, we have to decide where the info actually comes from. And the text splits this into two massive categories, right? Primary data collection and secondary data. Let's start with primary data collection. This is gathering fresh, unpublished data directly from the source. We are handing out the sleep trackers ourselves.
Precisely. Primary data collection is the gold standard for authenticity because, well, you control the environment.
You control the variables.
Exactly. But there's a severe trade-off. It is incredibly time-consuming. It's fiercely expensive. And it's highly prone to researcher bias.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you aren't careful, your own desire to find a cause for the insomnia might unconsciously influence how you record things.
Okay, so push back here. If primary collection is the absolute most authentic way to get information, why would a serious academic researcher ever risk using secondary data?
What?
Shouldn't I be doing the legwork myself? Relying on secondary data basically sounds like copying off your smart older sibling's homework. Except in academia, it's totally legal as long as you cite it.
It's a fair challenge, but it comes down to how science actually works. Science is cumulative. Secondary data is just information already collected by someone else.
Like census reports or hospital archives.
Right. If you insist on only using primary data, you're just ignoring the laws of physics and economics.
Because I don't have $10 million to survey a whole city.
Exactly. And more importantly, you can't time travel.
Yeah.
What if you need the sleep patterns from the 1990s to establish a baseline?
Oh, true.
You have no choice but to use secondary sources. You stand on the shoulders of giants. The verification step just means making sure those giants did their math right.
Makes sense. So to make sure you nail these distinctions on the exam,
Yes, get your pens ready.
these are 3 to 4 high-impact keywords to trigger your recall on multiple-choice questions. For primary data collection, your memory code is fresh, direct, authentic, slow.
Fresh, direct, authentic, slow. Got it.
And for secondary data, the memory code is secondhand, published, available, fast.
Keep those pairings in mind, because examiners love to test your ability to weigh those trade-offs, the authenticity of primary versus the speed of secondary.
Okay, so we know where it comes from. Next massive decision. How do we measure it? This is the 2 great rival schools of research, quantitative versus qualitative.
The epistemological debate of the century.
Right. Do we want the hard, undeniable scale of numbers or the deep, nuanced reality of human stories?
Let's start with the hard numbers. Quantitative data collection. This is data expressed entirely in numerical form.
Okay.
Its primary job is to prove or reject hypotheses using statistical algorithms.
Yeah.
It's highly objective, strips away human emotion to find hard correlations.
And it's usually presented in graphs and tables, right?
Exactly.
So the most common tool we'd use for our insomnia study is the quantitative survey and questionnaire. Like we send out 10,000 surveys.
Yes. And the hallmark of those quantitative surveys is the absolute reliance on closed-ended, fixed-choice questions.
Like rate your sleep on a scale from 1 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always struggled with this. Doesn't that deeply limit the respondent? Like, what if their actual experience isn't one of the 5 choices?
It completely limits them. And that is a deliberate, necessary trade-off.
Really?
When you're surveying 10,000 people, your biggest enemy is variability. If everyone answers in their own unique way, you can't run a statistical regression.
You need forced consistency.
Right. The text actually references the SQ3R reading method survey. Question, read, recite, review to show how structured comprehension works. In quantitative setups, ambiguity destroys your data.
You know, taking a closed-ended survey always reminds me of a terrible first date.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, nothing kills the vibe faster than someone who only lets you answer not at all or very often when you are just dying to tell your whole life story.
Right, which is exactly why the rival school exists.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is the sheer contrast in philosophy. Qualitative data collection is expressed in words, not numbers.
Words, okay.
It explores the underlying themes, behaviors, motivations that numbers just can't capture. It's inherently subjective.
And this is used in, like, case studies or ethnography.
Exactly, where you really immerse yourself.
So we'd use a qualitative survey and questionnaire. Instead of a 1 to 5 scale, we use open-ended questions. Describe what goes through your mind at 3 a.m.
Yes, and this is phenomenal for exploring unknown unknowns. If you only use quantitative scales, you only get answers to the questions you thought to ask.
Right.
Qualitative open-ended questions let subjects reveal variables you never even considered. Maybe they aren't sleeping because of a low-frequency hum from a new factory.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you'd never find that with a 1 to 5 stress scale.
Never. But the downside is the sheer volume of labor. Analyzing thousands of paragraphs of text to find themes is a monumental task compared to clicking a button on a spreadsheet.
So qualitative sample sizes are usually way smaller?
Much smaller.
All right, what does this mean for your exam prep? You need to lock in the differences. Your memory code for quantitative data collection is numbers, objective, fixed, fast.
And your memory code for qualitative data collection is words, subjective, open, deep.
Numbers, objective, fixed, fast versus words, subjective, open, deep.
That perfectly captures it. Quantitative scales up beautifully for consistency. Qualitative gives you rich context.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. The real world isn't a multiple choice test. What if we need both the massive scale to prove the problem and the depth to understand why?
Well, you don't have to choose just one. Modern research rarely does. That brings us to mixed data collection.
Okay.
This is the strategic integration of both qualitative and quantitative methods in a single study.
It sounds like getting the best of both worlds, but like double the work. What actually makes this better than doing 2 separate studies?
The operative mechanism is triangulation.
Triangulation?
Yeah, imagine you're lost in the woods. 1 GPS satellite gives you a rough idea of where you are. But 3 satellites looking from different angles. They triangulate your exact position.
I see.
Mixed data does that for truth. If your numerical data shows a 40% drop in sleep quality, and your interviews reveal stories of severe anxiety at night.
Those 2 different methods point to the exact same conclusion.
Exactly. It balances numerical analysis with contextual insights. It makes your findings incredibly robust.
The book uses some brilliant real-world examples for this, specifically looking at tech giants like Spotify and Airbnb heavily rely on mixed data collection.
They do.
Spotify looks at the quantitative side. They see a specific song is skipped millions of times in the first 10 seconds, but that number doesn't tell them why.
Right, it just tells them that it happened.
Exactly. So they need the qualitative side, like focus groups, to discover that the intro of the song sounds exactly like the default iPhone alarm clock, which just induces panic.
That is a perfect illustration. They combine user insights with actionable statistics.
So time for the memory code for mixed data collection. Lock these words in. Blend, balance, comprehensive, triangulate.
Blend, balance, comprehensive, triangulate. And if you see the word triangulate on the UGC NET exam,
immediately look for the mixed methods answer.
Very sharp strategy. They love using triangulation as a keyword.
Let's zoom in on one of the most powerful primary tools for gathering that deep qualitative data. Talking to people face-to-face. The interview.
Yes. An interview is a primary source of verbal data. And it's highly adaptable. It can be semi-structured, narrative, or a focus group.
But the success rests on the methodology, right?
Almost entirely.
The book is so specific about this. It's not just walking in with questions. I always thought an interview was like peeling an onion, getting to the core.
Yeah.
But honestly, a better analogy is a physical warm-up before a marathon.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if you walk up to an insomnia patient and your first question is probing childhood trauma, they're going to pull a psychological muscle. They'll shut down.
Exactly right. The structure dictates the data quality. You stretch the conversational muscles first. You start broad, general, comfortable questions to build trust.
And then move to the specific, sensitive core.
Yes, and group similar questions together so it flows logically.
The text also stresses the qualities of a successful interviewer. Ethical, open-minded, gentle, sensitive. And to be clear, this isn't just about being nice.
No, it's mechanical.
Being ethical and neutral is a requirement for valid data.
Right. If an interviewer reacts with shock or even like excessive agreement, they trigger social desirability bias. The participant alters their answers to appease the interviewer.
Corrupting the data.
Uncontaminating verbal data is hard. And beyond bias, you can destroy data through inaccurate recording. If you rely on memory instead of transcription, you're rewriting data through your own biases.
Which brings us to the memory code for the interview. Think of the warm-up. Ethical, neutral, general to specific, verbal.
Perfect.
So let's look at where we are in our hypothetical study. We chose a mixed methodology, gathered secondary baseline data, conducted massive quantitative surveys and deep qualitative interviews. We have a mountain of raw, verified info. We are finally ready to analyze it, right?
Not quite yet. There is a crucial invisible bridge between data collection and analysis. Skipping it is a recipe for disaster. We need to talk about the data management plan.
Right. Protecting the goods. You spent months, millions of dollars collecting pristine data. Before you analyze it, you got to make sure you don't lose it or accidentally expose the medical history of 10,000 people.
Exactly. A data management plan is a series of logistical decisions made before collection even begins. You can't retrofit security.
No.
A major component is anonymization. When collecting sensitive qualitative data, you must systematically strip away names, addresses, identifiers, absolute privacy.
The plan also involves structured formats. So data is organized across platforms, systematic transcription to minimize errors, and my absolute favorite, routine backups.
It sounds like basic IT advice, but data loss ruins major projects all the time.
I mean, seriously. A researcher who doesn't follow a strict data management plan with routine backups is basically just daring the universe to delete their thesis.
It's true.
A spilled cup of coffee should never end a multi-year study.
Security, structure, backups, they are non-negotiable.
All right, memory code time for the data management plan. Keep these four ready. Anonymize, backup, structure, secure.
Excellent. If you understand these core mechanics, you possess the fundamental blueprint of Chapter 2.
And as promised, we're giving you the ultimate exam hack. How do you easily retrieve all these terms when the clock is ticking on the UGC NET exam?
We synthesized a final overarching mnemonic device. When you sit down, write this acronym at the top of your scratch paper, PSQQMID.
PSQQMID. I love this. To remember the letters, think of the phrase, PS, quick questions make interviews deep.
Exactly.
Let's break it down line by line.
Okay, P stands for primary data collection.
S stands for secondary data.
The first Q is for quantitative data collection.
Your structured surveys. And the second Q is for qualitative data collection.
Right, capturing human depth. M stands for mixed data collection.
Where you triangulate the truth. I stands for interview.
And D stands for data management plan.
PSQ2MID. If you memorize that, you'll have a structural map ready to deploy the second you read a question about methodology.
It organizes the landscape perfectly. You'll eliminate incorrect multiple-choice options so fast.
Before we wrap, I want to reiterate that everything today, every framework, every debate came straight from UGC NET Paper 1 Unlocked, Volume 2 Research Aptitude. Grab a copy. It trains your mind to think exactly like an examiner.
It truly is a remarkable synthesis. And as we conclude our deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Lay it on us.
We talked about how qualitative data is historically very slow, highly subjective, and hard to analyze at scale. That's why the divide between the two schools exists.
Right.
But consider the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence. If modern software can now read thousands of pages of qualitative text, identify emotional themes, and categorize narratives almost as quickly as a spreadsheet calculates numbers.
Wow.
Will the strict dividing line between these two methodologies eventually disappear entirely?
If a machine can process the nuance of 10,000 interview diaries in the time it takes to run a multiple-choice survey, the whole foundation of how we build knowledge changes.
Exactly.
It's no longer a choice between scale and depth. You just get both instantly. That is a wild thought to end on. Keep your foundation strong, keep studying those memory codes, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.